Hi, we're here today with Dr. Jason Troyer, and we're going to be having a discussion today about rituals and how they can help us on our grief journey. If this is a topic that you're not ready to discuss, feel free to come back to this session a little bit later. Dr. Jason Troyer, thanks for joining us today. Before we even get started on the subject, thought it might be great to have you kind of introduce yourself and your background and tee up the subject for the day.
Sure, yeah. From a professional background, I've got a master's degree in counseling and a PhD in counseling psychology. Grief and loss has always been my area of research. My grief origin story, where I really got interested in the topic, is seeing both of my grandfathers be widowed and them having a really difficult time with the loss of my grandmothers. And so that led to me being really interested in widowers and men's grief, and that really expanded to how all people kind of deal with loss in various situations. On a more personal side, I'm married to my lovely wife, Jenny, and I have 3 daughters who are beginning the teenage years and a young daughter who's 6 years old.
Fantastic. Well, I'm really excited today to have this conversation. I think it's an important one, but we'll just dive right into the subject.
Right.
The first one, we're going to talk about rituals today, and I thought we'd start off with, what is a ritual? I think there's a lot of thoughts there. So
yeah, and I think rituals are just so incredibly important, and I define them a little bit differently than most people do. I think of a ritual as any meaningful symbolic action, and so that casts the net pretty wide. You know, certainly we most often talk about rituals as these big public events like weddings and graduations and funerals and remembrance services and those sorts of things. And without question, those rituals are incredibly important. They serve such a valuable need for us, especially in the situation when we're grieving. But what I'm really fascinated by is the fact that there are so many private moments that we have very individually, almost secret sorts of moments, and that those can happen multiple times a day. Sometimes they're one-time events, sometimes they're something we do on a daily basis, sometimes they're a seasonal sort of a thing, and how much meaning and purpose we find in those kind of meaningful actions that we do. And so often we might incorporate various objects and other symbols as a part of that, but it can really, really help us to focus on kind of putting our lives back together after grief. And it's almost a way of, when you feel like the quilt of your life or the fabric of your life has been torn, the rituals can really be a great way to kind of start to thread that back together.
Fantastic. Yeah. So why do we have them? Why do we as humans, why have we created these rituals, and how do they benefit us, like, for good?
Yeah, there are several what I call features of rituals that are, no matter what you're doing, whether it's a private moment or a public event, there are several features that really are so critical to their benefits. And one of the things is that, especially with grief and loss, we feel like so much control has been taken away from us. And so rituals are an opportunity to help us answer the question of, what do I do now? And so that can be really helpful with these public rituals like a funeral, where while we can fill in the details and we can personalize it to our loved one and our family, there are some kind of more commonly used things that we can kind of use as anchors or as ways to kind of get started. In that midst of, I don't know what to do, we can do that. Another feature of ritual that is really beneficial is that while some people are very in touch with their emotions throughout loss, there are other folks who feel constrained or feel disconnected from their grief. They feel like they may be stuck in a sense of shock and those sorts of things. And rituals are these unique opportunities to give us permission to grieve and share those emotions, and permission to do some other things that we might be not as comfortable doing. And I think a really common example, what I think of as the ritual of a wake or a visitation, is this unique opportunity to share stories about our loved ones. And those are some of those stories we're just not comfortable talking about unless we're in a visitation or wake or funeral situation. And so the ritual of having a visitation or wake kind of gives us permission to share some of these stories. And it's like, okay, this is the time to do it. And that's why I'm so sad when people choose not to do some of those things, because they lose those opportunities to gain these stories, learn about their loved one. And people may just not come up to you later on and share those same stories without that context, without that bubble. That is a third feature of rituals. It kind of gives us a time and place encapsulation of our grief. So often we feel like our grief is unending, it's all encompassing. And what rituals can do is kind of, we don't want to say it's going to put our grief in a box, but rituals do have a beginning and an end. So sometimes I might use the example of grieving parents who unfortunately have lost a child, and maybe they're coming up on the birthday of that child, which they know it's going to be a difficult day, it's going to be challenging. And so what they might do is choose to kind of focus on a few specific rituals, especially maybe even early on in the day. They might visit a gravesite. They might choose to, go buy 5 or 10 toys and donate them to a local charity or something like that. And it's not like they're not going to grieve the rest of the day, but there is a focus to their grief that can kind of a beginning and ending to those activities that kind of encapsulate it a little bit more. And they might be a little bit more likely the rest of the day to focus on some other things. We see the same sorts of things with holidays. I often give people the advice that during the holiday season and they've had a loss that they're still experiencing pretty strongly, to carve out time to really focus on it. And then it also might give you a little bit more permission to step away from your grief a little bit and enjoy the holiday season and the festivities and those sorts of things.
So you have kind of two sides of these rituals. There's communal, and then there's something that's maybe a little bit more personal that's there. Wondering if you can kind of talk to both and why both are important.
Yeah, the big advantage of a communal group public sort of event is that it is the power of this shared experience. And if you've ever been at a concert of your favorite band or music artist or something like that, there's an energy in the room. There's a sense of I have something in common with all of these people. And like I mentioned before, the obvious power of things like funerals and other memorial services is the opportunity to share stories and how often we learn things about our loved ones. My father is the oldest child on his side of the family. I was at my grandfather's funeral. His father, I was standing right next to him in the reception line, and to hear, 86-year-old Amish farmers who lived the farm over from my grandfather tell stories about him as a young boy that my father had never heard and that I had certainly never heard. And after those were so important, and just kind of little weird anecdotes about him and those sorts of things. And what struck me later on was that some of those quirky, funny stories I'll tell my kids and my grandkids. And it's like that's a 6 or 7 generation story now. And if I wasn't here, I wouldn't have heard that at all. I wouldn't know that about him. And so to see aspects of your loved one and how they impacted other people in different settings and situations can be so powerful. What I love about private events, private rituals, is that we can be focused on our own needs. And so often we have this individual relationship with our loved one, and because of their loss, we're missing out on some very specific things. We're having some specific challenges. Some things feel unfinished. So that might be an unfinished conversation that you have with them, a last opportunity to say certain things. And that may come up later in life. I didn't realize I wanted to have that conversation until 10, 20, 30 years later. And now, for example, if a person who loses a mother, now when that woman becomes a mother, now I have new things I wanted to talk to my mom about. And so we can use rituals like writing letters and other things to kind of complete that whole. It is symbolic, unfortunately we can't bring them back to have that direct conversation with them, but we shouldn't underestimate the power of the symbols and those meaningful actions.
So it seems like there's two different types of rituals or timings of them. One could be a repeated ritual that maybe happens on an important date or, an anniversary, holidays. But as you mentioned, a ritual could also be a singular event, maybe, of an act of writing a letter. Maybe speak to the singular versus the reoccurring rituals.
Yeah. It is interesting to see the varieties of experience there. So often, I've talked to especially widowed people, and of course, the loss of having your partner, and we share so much of our lives with our spouses, and that those day-to-day actions, and there seems to be such a void there as one example. And so the simple act of waking up and not having somebody to say good morning to. And so I would say it's absolutely a ritual to say good morning to their picture on the nightstand. Each of those little moments can be a moment of connection where we still feel close with our loved one, bring us comfort, and just always make sure we always remember them. I think one big type of ritual that we sometimes do is I'm a big fan of expanding the definition of pilgrimage. And I think a pilgrimage is any sort of meaningful journey. And so that might be the loss of a parent. And so maybe you no longer live in the town that you grew up in. And so you decide, you just feel an urge deep down inside that you need to do something. And so you fly back, you drive back to that hometown, you drive around, you stand in front of the house you lived in, those sorts of, you visit the typical places, you have lunch at the place you used to go with them, those sorts of things. And maybe you just kind of see what memories come back. And you just kind of feel the feels. You do whatever comes up, so to speak. And it's like, okay, there was something in me that needed this. I don't need to do it every year. Maybe I don't need to do it ever again, but it was important for me to be here. So these one-time rituals may kind of spring up by happenstance. You just kind of feel this kind of have to trust your gut about what do I need right now, and being okay with going with that, and just like, may not make sense to anybody else, but it's important to me.
Interesting. So when you feel it, lean into it, and there may be some wisdom behind it that helps you on your grief journey. The next question I have is, how do rituals connect us to the grief experience? And as you answer that, can you avoid that? I think with grief, there's people that try to push it off or avoid it because it's painful, but maybe talk about the important role, I guess, that rituals play in the grief experience.
I think it is a misnomer, the phrase time heals. Unfortunately, grief is not just running out the clock. Like if I wait 2 years, then I'm going to be over it, no matter what I do in that interim period of time. Unfortunately, that's just not the case. So what grief can do is provide these kind of, if we think about like our grief journey is kind of crossing a river, I see rituals as the stepping stones. Like they give us the opportunity to make progress in that journey. Just simply doing any sort of ritual isn't necessarily healing, but doing the right ritual for us that is meaningful. So it can, there's a theory of grief that is not often talked about, but it is called the dual process model of grief by Dr. Maggie Strobe. And what the dual process model suggests is that there are times that we need to kind of step into our grief and fully experience it, and then we need an opportunity to step back from it and rebuild. There's things going on in our lives. We have to kind of rebuild. We have to kind of take care of practical matters. We have to, maintain our relationships with the living. And what I love about ritual is that it gives us an opportunity, like I was talking about before, that encapsulation of time and space. We can kind of step in, feel the feels, do the work, and then the ritual ends. And we step back and say, okay, now I've got to pay the bills, and I've got to do my taxes, and I've got to take kids to soccer practice and those sorts of things. And so often I hear this from people, and quite honestly, especially men. If I step into this, I'm going to start crying, I'm never going to stop. Or I'm going to start grieving and it's never going to end. And I think that encapsulation of rituals is like, there's going to be an opportunity. The ritual will end and we'll step back and we're going to be okay. But I understand the fear. Yeah.
And it's interesting, I think, as you mentioned, funerals, for example. And some don't want to have a funeral. Maybe they missed the funeral, they didn't attend it. That may delay that process, right? And that's why, even though it's painful, but to have that communal ritual experience can ignite that to go, okay, that is beneficial. And then they may do more of those events in the future.
Yeah, I think funerals are such a critical first step in our grief process. And because I know some people say, well, funerals they might seem outdated or they seem like I'm going through the motions, but there's a benefit to that where it's like we don't have to plan it from scratch. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. It's nice to have a few anchor points there to draw from, and then you can personalize it in various ways. that opportunity to do that. But funerals are a great first step. There's always more work to be done.
The next question is, are rituals more valuable in times of joy or sorrow, and why?
That's a great question. I certainly think that rituals are a great time to celebrate accomplishments, celebrate milestones. We have rituals where we connect with our friends, our family, our tribe, whatever you want to call it, the people who really understand us. And so there are lots of opportunities for us to use rituals to celebrate, to practice gratitude. Those sorts of things are all great uses of rituals as well. I do think that those come a little bit easier because we tend not to be afraid of them. I think the lesson is still important, though, that we need to recognize that this is worth it. I do think that rituals have a special part to play in dealing with challenges, grief, loss, challenging milestones, the loss of certain roles that we might have, the loss of certain abilities, those sorts of things, because they can assuage some of the fear that we talked about just a minute ago. They give us that framework to really get in there, do the work, feel the feels, and then be able to step back out of it and acknowledge this is real. This is something's been lost here, a relationship or an opportunity, and that needs to be grieved. And it's going to make my life easier if I do that.
You spoke about rituals that we do in the living, weddings, graduations, birthdays. What is it about the death, dying, and grief experience that makes rituals or like a ritualistic approach beneficial to processing the magnitude of that experience?
Yeah, I think it is absolutely the use of symbols. The opportunity in a loss and a death situation, so many things are lost and so many things feel unfinished and so many things feel cut off. And so either we are stuck with that and say, I guess that will never happen, or we've got to, using symbols, whether it's a symbolic action or an actual physical symbol, we need to have this opportunity to, how do I finish this? How do I ever get to a point where I feel like it's come full circle and I feel a little bit more settled with it? Not that it would take away grief or anything like that. You might have the example of an older couple who've always wanted to go on this kind of absolutely amazing retirement trip. And I'd actually talked with a widower, and his wife died, 2 months before they retired, and so that didn't happen. And so either you're kind of stuck with, this is not only did I lose my wife, but I lost this thing we were looking forward to. You may choose at a certain time to decide, like, I'm going to go on the trip, and I'm going to bring a representation of my wife along with me. I'm going to bring some of her, pack a few items of her clothes. I'm going to get to the top of Kilimanjaro or the top of the Eiffel Tower, whatever it is, and I'm going to say a few words to her. I'm going to incorporate her in this trip and make her a part of it. And I know that is never as good as the real thing, but it can be incredibly powerful and meaningful to the individual. And so the power of ritual to be able to help us kind of complete the whole. In psychology terms, we talk about completing the gestalt, this unfinished whole, and having a sense of like, okay, I took care of it. I finished what I set out to do, and I was still able to do that the best that I could in that opportunity.
You used the word symbols. Maybe just expand upon what symbols you're referencing as it relates to rituals.
Yeah, and I think the symbols can apply to whatever might be meaning for someone. Certainly, a very common one is the idea of lighting a candle. You're always going to be in my memory, or the other associations that we have with candles, whether they're tied to our religious traditions or just our personal traditions, those sorts of things. But I remember being in a grief group with some college students, and a freshman had lost her sister in a car accident. And she announced to the group that she was wearing her sister's belt. And back then, I was unfortunately really wet behind the ears and didn't know very much. And thankfully, I didn't say very much, but I asked my supervisor about it later on. It's like, isn't that kind of weird that she's got her sister's belt? And he looked me in the eye and he's like, is there anything about what she said today that suggests that she doesn't acknowledge that her sister's died? Is she having any sort of abnormal reaction? I'm like, no, it's all normal. He's like, what does it matter? The belt is meaningful to her. That is a connection to her sister. They were 1 or 2 years apart. They shared clothes like a lot of sisters do, probably argued over that and those sorts of things. And so that was just really important for her to kind of like a part of my sister's with me. And so the symbols might not make sense to anybody else, whether it's a trinket or a symbolic action. But as long as it makes sense to you, it's all that really matters.
For many people, grief is a painful experience. It hurts and it can be difficult. Rituals, though, can help us move through that pain a little easier, smoother, more peacefully. Why is that?
Yeah, I think a portion of that is the ability to step in and step out, and the opportunity, because it can feel so absolutely overwhelming. It can also create an opportunity to bring together around that specific ritual. If we kind of, I know I've talked a lot about private rituals, but to jump to the group experience, this opportunity of being able to bring people together and give them permission to kind of come together. I talked with a young widower whose wife unfortunately died of cancer around age 30, and they had met being camp counselors for many years together for teenagers. And so they were still connected to a lot of the camp counselors who came back year after year, the staff. And so he decided that he had a more traditional funeral service, but I think he also had a service back at the camp, and friends showed up and they sang some of the songs they knew as camp counselors. And in the middle, they would always typically end the week with a big bonfire. And so they had another big bonfire, and he decided he wanted to, a part of her needed to be there. And so some of her ashes were put into that fire to kind of be this place where they had met together. But rituals can kind of give us those excuses to come together, to share those emotions, and then it can end.
When you talk about rituals, common rituals that occur during death and grief and loss, we talked about funerals, and that's probably the most common ritual that we're familiar with. What are some other common ones that we maybe are doing, but we don't even realize that we're doing them?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is anytime we're dealing with personal objects, that might be one of them. Another one that is so commonly done, but also a very private experience that we rarely talk about or don't often share, are visits to a place of final rest, a cemetery, or other places. And so that opportunity to, different people go there on different days. They might bring something with them. Is there a symbol of that person or something that they liked, or some way I remember them? It's a picture, it's a toy, it's whatever it might be. What do you say while you're there, out loud or to yourself? That's a really common one that we might do. The idea of rituals in terms of reminiscing about their life, playing certain songs, watching videos, looking at old pictures are certainly some really common ones that we do. One that doesn't come up very often, but I think absolutely can be a ritual, is taking over some of their tasks or adopting some of their attributes. And so I've talked with widowers who felt it was really important that they took over their wife's rose garden and really paid attention, or their vegetable garden. It's like one way that I'm kind of honoring her memory is taking care of these things that were so important to her. And I feel connected to her when I do that. And it might be a little bit more lighthearted things like cheering for the same sports teams that they cheered for, celebrating when they do well, and going through anguish when they don't do well, and those sorts of things. But there are a lot of those, when you look at it as my definition of any sort of meaningful symbolic action, it really casts the net pretty wide. There are times I wish there was almost another synonym for ritual that didn't have some of this, I don't want to call it baggage, but some of this weight to it that makes it feel like we've got to get dressed up in special clothes and be at a church or a sanctuary to do it. But on the other hand, it's more than a habit. Things we do out of habit, the difference for me between a habit and like a daily ritual would be the meaning that is embedded in it.
We've talked a lot about rituals and how they may impact us individually with grief, but we also help others process their grief as well. So maybe you could speak to that as we as grievers are maybe helping support other people that are grieving. what things should we take into consideration as we look at that in helping others?
Yeah, the example that comes to mind is helping children with grief rituals. And for all of us, we want things, to make things more tangible. It makes it easier, but especially for kids who, the concept of death and the permanence of death and those sorts of things can make it especially difficult to wrap their brains around. And so, the relatively simple things that a lot of really good funeral homes do, the color, do you want to color a page and put it in the casket? Do you want to be a part of the service in a way where you're participatory? Maybe you are an honorary casket bearer or pallbearer, and maybe you can't quite lift it, but you can put your hand on the bar, or you can put your hand on the handle, and you're going to be a part of it. I remember every single time that I've been a casket bearer, pallbearer, and it was meaningful every single time. So just looking for different ways that we can help folks be participatory. And I think those are some of the best funerals where we can look for opportunities to make as many people have an active role as possible, even if it's a very small, brief sort of a thing.
Two different sides of the rituals. You kind of have rituals that represent the old and rituals that represent the new. Maybe speak to that.
And in some cases, it is the mementos, the saying hi to the picture. It is honoring our loved one and our relationship with them. The rituals to the new, sometimes we have to take old family traditions and make them new. And so that might be, changing the food at your holiday event and those sorts of things. It might be an opportunity. And, so often with grief and loss, it kind of forces growth. And so sometimes it is an opportunity to celebrate, recognize, and have a ritual for kind of, okay, I'm taking some new steps. So often rituals kind of encompass the first time we did something. This is the first time I've done this without them, or the first time I've done this on our own. And I can certainly see that might be an unintended ritual, but as you reflect back on it, it's like, oh, that was the first time I did that without my dad.
One thing I'd love to talk about is retaining a ritual versus replacing a ritual. And maybe to tee up that a little bit more, thinking about moving on past that ritual that maybe is holding you back. Maybe if you could speak to that.
There are certainly situations where rituals can become, can create a rut more than it being meaningful and helpful. It might be a situation where we're kind of being tied to the past. Now, that can happen. It doesn't happen too often, but it's certainly a situation. My benchmark for kind of evaluating those sorts of things has to do with how is it affecting your personal development? Because the natural progression of life is growth, in my opinion. And so is it impeding that growth? And also probably equally important is how does it affect your relationship with the living? And so if we are so invested in our rituals that we are ignoring the people who are still trying to care for us and are important to us, obviously that's a problem. We need to adjust some things. But we don't want it to almost turn into kind of some of the aspects of more of an obsessive compulsive negative aspect of a ritual, but without question, how is it impacting how well we heal and those sorts of things.
What can we do maybe to replace or enhance or progress these rituals where we're not forgetting about this individual, but we're able to still honor them and connect to them in a new way?
Yeah, well, one example might be that I think it's great to visit a cemetery site, place where a loved one is laid to rest. If we are, maybe we have an example of parents who are doing that because they lost a child in a terrible situation. I can understand them going and visiting quite a bit. I think that's quite normal. If, however, it is to the point where our other surviving children are like, you never come to our ball games, or you never show up, you miss the parent-teacher conference, or those sorts of things. It's like there has to be some sort of balance here. I would never say that you should never go back to the gravesite, but how is it balancing out the needs of our other children and those sorts of things?
So rituals don't need to be textbook, that it's here's the formula, and you need to do exactly this. It's very personal, and kind of what does your heart and your gut tell you that you should do,
Yeah.
and if that will help you in your healing, then it's worthwhile.
Yeah, so often you ask people like, you start talking about rituals, and it's really common for people to say, I've always wanted to do X, Y, or Z, or if there was some way to do it. And that's why I love examples of rituals that people be like, oh, I don't want to do exactly that, but now that you've planted the seed, I can create my own version of that. And so I love to hear a nice variety of examples about rituals in different situations for that help meet certain needs, and that might be tied to rituals associated with mothers or fathers, or rituals associated with the loss of a child, and rituals to help meet certain psychological needs. So, but at the bottom of it, you've really got to just trust your gut and then give yourself permission to do it. And I would also say you need to probably have some quiet moments where you give your body, brain, and heart the opportunity for you to kind of sense those urges, feel those needs. And if you're staying busy all the time, it's going to be hard to kind of listen to your gut because you're just too involved.